Okay, so I'm here to talk about sex writing online. And when I say sex writing, I don't necessarily mean porn, although the term can encompass porn and erotica as well. When I say sex writing, I mean writing that engages with sex, writing that is about sex, in any form, whether it's fiction, memoir, essay, or poetry. And I especially want to talk about that writing that is published on an online platform. I want to note before I continue that parts of this talk are based on a panel discussion that took place during the Digital Writers Festival. That's available online if you want to watch, featuring fellow Scum editors Sean Campbell and James Butler, as well as Scum contributors Kat Muscat and Emmy Ray, as well as me. So some of the ideas that I'll be covering were originally brought up there by the geniuses on the rest of the panel. And I want to make clear that because this is a huge topic, like sex writing on the internet is vast, much vaster than I could attempt to cover in 20 minutes. I'm going to be covering a lot of ground in not much time, and there's going to be a bunch of generalizations, but bear with me, and if you take issue with any of them, please feel free to bring that up during question time, and I'll try to defend myself. I just want to start a discussion about what the intersection between sex, writing, and the internet can be. I'm not going to talk about the negative aspects of sex on the internet, because while all new forms of existence, and the internet definitely counts as a new form of existence, while all of them have their positives and negatives, any of us can very easily find pretty much anywhere polemics detailing the evils of the internet, especially with regard to sex, just as previous generations could find polemics about the evils of the telephone, typewriter, printing press, papyrus, and clay tablet. You don't need to hear more about how bad the internet and sexting and writing about sex and young people doing sex is. I'm here to demonstrate how writing sex online is great. But first I'm going to introduce myself a little more. My name's Sam. I'm a feminist, heterosexual woman, a writer and an editor, and I work almost exclusively online. I edit 2 online publications, one of which is the literary magazine Scum, which describes itself as feminist-friendly writing for people who haven't figured it out yet, which could be everyone, depending on what your definition of having figured it out is. I'm a member of the last generation of people to remember a time before the internet, however hazily, which means I'm almost but not quite a digital native. Still, I live on the internet, like most of my peers, probably like most of you, like most of humanity. I'm social online. I read online far more than I read in print. I write for online formats, so blogs, other online journals, Twitter, Tumblr, they count as writing. And I engage with sex and sexuality online, and I have for my entire adult life. I care about sex writing online because sex and the internet are prominent aspects of my life as a human person and as a writer. Why do we write at all? We write to connect with one another and to seek truth about the human condition. And sex, and since not so recently, the internet, they're both big parts of that. So I want to start where so many of us start learning about sex, which is porn. I first encountered porn when I was 11. I found it in the spam folder of my very first Hotmail account. It was the email pornography equivalent of a Big W catalogue. It was called Lesbo 101. And it had pictures of smiling girls pressing pastel-coloured dildos into one another, and then links to see more of the same, and I was thrilled. I keep seeing these days this discourse pop up in the opinion pages of mainstream newspapers, on those hand-wringing websites written by and for middle-aged white ladies, and in endless Twitter conversations, this idea that porn has ruined the sexual minds of my generation. that we're a group of addicts with our brains addled by eternally hard cocks and hairless pussies, a generation of John Ruskins afraid to consummate relationships with real flesh creatures, that young men are brutes who'll accept nothing less than physical perfection and total subservience, and that young women are allowing themselves to be subjugated in our pursuit of desirability above all else. But this just isn't true. I'm 24. I'm at the top of Triple J's target demographic, but I am still a young person. And since that early encounter with my spam folder, I have regularly watched and read porn and taken nude selfies, and I'm now a veteran sexter. And I also have a sex life that is nothing like the pornography I consume, because I understand that porn is not real life, and so do you. I'm not an outlier here. We engage critically with the media that we consume. And to think that a whole generation of people, especially writers, who have grown up informed by online pornography, have also grown up uncritical of it and unexposed to the difference between sex in real life and as it is portrayed online, is incredibly naive. And young writers writing about sex tend to be anything but naive. 11 is young, but it's no younger than any of my peers. And this early exposure to pornography can make for a deeper understanding of the breadth and nuance of sexuality. For example, were it not for the internet and the porn therein, I wouldn't know about queerness, or at least not until very recently. Polyamory, demisexuality, transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, these are all terms that I would be totally ignorant of were it not for the internet. And were it not for watching and enjoying lesbian porn as a young straight girl, I probably would have never questioned my own sexuality, and by doing so, become aware of the sexuality of others. Like I said, young people aren't ignorant or uncritical of the cultural artifacts that we're given, including porn. Once we've caught our breath, we can consider our porn and our sexual practices in a socio-political context as well as a pleasurable one. But it seems to me, and it has seemed to me for a while, that while sex is clearly a part of our lives, literature tends not to engage with it in the way in which it engages with pretty much anything else. I read novels to learn how to be a person. Literature has taught me vast amounts about ambition, failure, joy, art, despair, race, gender, love, but little about sex. Not about how to do it, but as a phenomenon that occurs between people. The sex I read in traditional literature is either a plot point or it's rape. It's rare for me to read about the kind of sex that I have, like regular, non-earth-shaking sex, or routine sex, bored sex, mutually satisfying midweek sex. I'm not the only one who feels like this either, which I've learned from editing Scum. Like I said, Scum, which is the online literary magazine that I helped to edit, since we started, it's existed as a place for people for writing by people who are still figuring it out. So that can mean it's writing by previously unpublished authors, or writing that addresses difficult topics that couldn't be published elsewhere, or writing that asks questions we've been wanting to ask but haven't been able to. We've tried with Scum to fill a gap that we saw existing in the literary landscape. And almost by accident, Scum seems to also have filled a gap where we can address sex in a way that is honest, awkward, complicated, everything that sex in porn and in mainstream literature isn't. Authors feel safe sending us work that talks about the crinkles in sex, the uncomfortable bits, the elbows in the eye. And it's part of a movement online that is fostering an understanding of sex and its role in our generation that's rich and complex. This kind of writing is digitally native. It lives online, not just in Scum, but in alt-lit publications like Moo Moo House, on blogs like Lena Chen's Sex and the Ivy or Rachel Rabbit White's Slut Ever, on the Tumblrs and Twitters of writers like Mira Gonzalez, Marie Calloway, and Megan Boyle. As Emmy Ray said during our digital writers discussion, part of the joy of this movement of internet sex writing is the depictions of average sex. Not bad sex, but ordinary sex, what Emmy called really real and interesting, great average sex. Emmy writes poetry, beautiful poetry, and some of the most interesting stuff I've read about sex on the internet has been in the form of poetry, because the internet lends itself to that form, and poetry lends itself to the forms of online writing, tweets, Tumblr posts, these tiny snippets of life experience that are digestible and rebloggable and instantly recognizable. And part of the reason it's exciting to read about sex online is because in sex more than anything in our lives, the specter of what is and isn't normal hangs over us. But online, in these instantly recognizable snippets of people's consciousness, we find that normal is a fallacy. These sparks of familiarity assure us that we're not alone, we're not abnormal. Other people have ordinary sex, or have built GeoCities shrines to Leonardo DiCaprio, or are heavily invested in a perceived romance between Captain Kirk and Spock. It's a pleasure to see yourself reflected in the vast network of written identity that is the internet. I mention Kirk and Spock because, along with my spam folder, the other cornerstone of my burgeoning sexuality was fanfiction. For those who are new to the term, is anyone new to the term fanfiction? Yeah, I don't think so. But it's fiction written by a fan of featuring characters from a particular film or TV series or piece of literature. Essentially, it's fans using the world that the author has built to further their engagement with the characters, and often they do it in a sexual manner. As a young teen, while visual porn was driving home the sexualized natures of women's bodies, literary porn, which is what makes up a vast majority of fan fiction, was introducing me to what would become a lifelong pleasure, which is sexy men. Let's look at my first fanfic love, which was Harry Potter. For every sexy Harry and Hermione escapade in the astronomy tower, there are 10 Harry Draco, Harry Ron, Harry Snape, Snape Dumbledore, Hagrid Dumbledore, and Hagrid Dobby erotic stories. Most of them incredibly filthy, most of them luxuriating in the visual depiction of male bodies. And this happens in few other areas, this sexualization of the male form. Porn for gay men is one of those areas, but fan fiction's audience has always been dominated by women and girls. And this is sexy gay writing for ladies. And in this sense, fan fiction occupies a queer space. During the Digital Writers Festival discussion that I keep talking about, Kat Muscat raised the excellent point that by playing with familiar characters and narratives in queer contexts, fan fiction allows queer youths a way to normalize their sexuality. And this is just one example of how subversive writing sex online can be. We use it to flip dominant social ideas about sex, and it's so important. We know that sex is not always glossy, it's not always heterosexual, it's not always groundbreaking, and now we've started to write it like that. So we've entered an era where we can acknowledge that sex is not always the most beautiful moment between two people in love, where there are mutual orgasms and everyone is fulfilled and at peak pleasure, and it's, the earth moves and rockets go off and stuff like that. We can acknowledge now, especially in these online spaces, that sex is funny and ridiculous and sometimes incredibly mundane, and that it's worth writing about. This normalization of sex is so important. We normalize in our writing every other aspect of our lives. Beautiful literature is written about boring shit. But it works, and now we're starting to do it about sex, which can just be boring shit. And it's important because when we start to write sex like this, we can approach an accurate depiction of genuine intimacy. but this can be a double-edged sword, especially when you're writing about your own life. When you're accurately depicting the genuine intimacy that you've shared with particular people, the question of ethics comes up, because you need to find a way to write about your own sex life without exploiting the other people involved. How private is too private? When does it stop being your story and start being someone else's? A piece we published on Scum by the aforementioned Cat Muscat called "So Your Dick Isn't Perpetually Hard" manages to talk about sexual dysfunction in a way that is reasonable, personal, and respectful to all parties involved. And that's not an easy feat, but it's one that all writers attempting to broach topics like this need to attempt, especially in nonfiction, because we need to take care of the people we've been intimate with, including when we choose to write about them. But writing about our sex lives can also be a way to take care of ourselves, whether through fiction or nonfiction. Part of the beauty of writing online is that we write while being simultaneously aware of being watched and also while being profoundly alone, which makes for unselfconscious and devastating statements like the following, which is from Megan Boyle's Everyone I've Ever Had Sex With. It's a piece that reads as memoir but was published as fiction. And the statement is, "One night after we broke up, he sexually assaulted me and I dropped out of school." That's the only sentence out of the entire piece that mentions that incident. And maybe that's an accurate depiction of this character's experience with sexual assault. Maybe it is a one-line event. Maybe it's not. But living and writing on the internet allows a level of control over one's experiences that's unparalleled by other media. You're in charge online not just of your written words, but your internet presence. You choose how to be, in your literature and in your interactions with others. And in that sense, we're still in a golden transition period where it feels like the internet isn't really real life and that we can make the person who we appear to be online into a better person than we are in real life, or a more healed person, or a safer person. And then maybe we can start to be them for real as well. More than anything, the internet is a place where ideas are disseminated, and of course, everyone here knows how powerful ideas can be. Now more than ever, we have access to discussions about consent, gender, feminism, queerness, and it's all enabled by our obsession with writing ourselves and our experiences online, including our sexual selves and experiences. And this is a good obsession. As writers, we learn to live in stories, and our sex lives are no different. Sex is part of who we are, and the internet just allows us to realize that part in all the complexity it deserves.